Hello, welcome to the new episode of All That Jazz. I'm your host, Matthias or Matt, and this is with me, Josh. And he's the reason I know Josh. I think I've met you in a lecture. I'm not sure, but we both are really big into Dr. Hawkins, and he discovered him a lot earlier than I. So he's got a lot more experience and all that. So welcome to the show, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt.
So I discovered Doc in some obscure forum like in 2006, and initially I thought it was the power versus force was about. I thought it was about because I was like, you have to understand the timeline. I was like 20. This was like I thought it was something about attraction. It said power versus force. I thought it was like, but then the wrong motivation, and I went there and I actually illegally downloaded the video, but I did that back in the day. I don't do that anymore. I wouldn't recommend it now. But how did you find Dr. Hawkins?
Well, I think just like most spiritual students, I first started reading all sorts of sort of spiritual new age material. Kind of had a natural curiosity about spirituality when I was I'd say about 21 or 22 years old. And then that led to my grandmother, actually. She was brought up in the Unity Church, I think back in like the 50s. So she had like sort of a unusual early exposure to sort of like a pure spirituality. So she was already doing the Course in Miracles like back in the 1970s, 1980s.
Wow.
And then she actually had the book Power versus Force way before I even heard of Dr. Hawkins. She might have actually had the book like Power versus Force came out in 1995, so she might have had the book, in the late 90s.
Wow.
So then she, for Christmas, she bought me the book called The Power of Intention by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And I just tore through that book. And that led to a whole bunch of interesting experiences, because that was like my first real exposure to probably more pure spirituality and not just new age-ism. So I started reading The Power of Intention and studying the principles from Dr. Wayne Dyer. A lot of like what you hold in mind tends to manifest, sort of raising your vibration, practicing basic forms of spirituality, from like forgiveness to kindness to focusing on the beauty of all things. So I read The Power of Intention, and in that book, he mentioned Power versus Force, Dr. David Hawkins, and then he also mentioned the book I Am That by Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. So I picked up both of those about the same time. I was reading a lot of I Am That, and then also every Sunday when I went to the Unity Church, I picked up Power versus Force, tore through that book, and then the following week I might have picked up Truth versus Falsehood next, and then Eye of the I, and then just like tore through each book every single week.
Wow.
So that was about 2000, probably early 2004 when I first got into Dr. Hawkins.
Yeah, at that time, not many people, even now, I feel like it's picking up, like a lot more people know of him. But yeah, Wayne Dyer, and I remember Louise Hay. This was like, I think the year she died, there was uh, uh, for some reason, Letting Go was on sale on Kindle. It was like really low price, and I feel like a lot of people discovered his work because like Wayne Dyer and Louise Hay both recommended the Kindle book version of the book, because it was so like, I think it was like $3 or something for like a period of a few months, and a lot of people bought it then, and I feel like the ratings, like how many reviews were on Amazon, because I was tracking it because I was so like fascinating, like how many people are going to discover Doc, and it was like just went skyrocketed how many people discovered it. So okay, 2004. So you read it, and then was it a difference like when you read I Am That versus Doc, Power versus Force?
Yeah, I would say I think I first tore into I Am That. Um, I remember sitting in my bedroom. I lived at home at the time, and I was in Atlanta, Georgia, back in those days. And every night I would read I Am That, and then I would go for a walk around the neighborhood by myself, kind of contemplating what I just read. And I remember having some like really high experiences back then, sort of like going into states of really high joy, like verging ecstasy at the awareness of my own existence.
Mm.
So there was like some really high states that happened early on. And then I remember one particular experience that happened. I was sitting on the bed in my brother's room, and my brother and my mom were both in the room with me, and I was reading this book by Nisargadatta Maharaj called The Experience of Nothingness. And I was sitting there reading the book, and I read this sentence, or this little, you know, dialogue between Nisargadatta and the student. And all of a sudden, like, I had an itch in my foot, and I reached down to scratch my foot, and the sense of a personal self like totally disappeared, and I saw that the body was moving all by itself. And it lasted like in, you know, clock time for, you know, maybe, you know, a minute or two. Um, but it was like the body reached down, scratched the foot, and I realized there was nobody that just did that. It happened totally by itself. And I remember going into like a state of like tears started coming out of my eyes. Felt like this kind of this infinite compassion for everything. And that was like one of the first like major experiences that I had from reading Nisargadatta Maharaj. And like I said, about the same time as when I found Dr. Hawkins, and I started tearing through Doc's books. And you know, I didn't really grasp Dr. Hawkins' teachings at first. I remember I like couldn't stop reading his material. But it wasn't until I shortly after these experiences happened, I moved to California. I wanted to go back west, and then I started listening to Dr. Hawkins' Beyond the Ordinary interviews. And then something in me said, you know, you got to go out and see this guy. You got to go drive out to Sedona and go to one of these satsangs. So, and that was what year was that? About the end of 2005.
Yeah, it was same for me. And when I discovered him in 2006, I also was watching some lectures. I'm not gonna say how I got them.
That's funny.
I was yeah, and then I got the sense at some point, I think he's not gonna live too long, and I got this strong sense that I really need to see him at a lecture, and all you know, all his work. And you know, he talks about the benefit of being in the presence of a teacher and all that. So yeah.
So you flew out from.
From I went from not really traveling anywhere to being playing video games a lot to going from Central Europe, Slovenia, to all the way to Los Angeles, and blowing all my savings on that trip. Well, I did go to an NBA game the day prior to the lecture, but okay, that was like my treat because I was
Yeah.
in LA, you know. Might
Okay.
as well do two things at the same time. So
Oh, for sure. So you drove out from LA to Sedona?
no, it was in Long Beach. It was
Oh,
in
long.
a like a hotel, maybe Hilton or something. I don't know which hotel it was. But yeah, it was amazing. Like first time in US, and then bang, I see his lecture. And I remember at the time I would just tell people I would just went to see an NBA game because I think I I thought that people wouldn't understand. I was probably right that I was going to, yeah, to see a spiritual talk. So how was the first lecture? Like that's like for people now that are discovering Doc, like that was something special, right? To be there and to see Doc in person.
Yeah, I remember. So I moved out to LA and was living with my uncle, and then I decided to drive out to Sedona to go see this satsang, and that was March 2006. And I remember, so that satsang was at the Creative Life Center, and I remember getting there early and then standing in line, and there was people already like lined up like hours before it started. So I remember just like feeling extremely joyful and couldn't stop laughing, just like there was so much joy. And I think like the overwhelming beauty of Sedona was pretty intense too. So, and I remember just being like thrilled to be with all these like-minded people. And then I remember going into the Sedona Creative Life Center, and it was all loud, all kinds of people talking and conversing with each other. And I think Dr. Hawkins might have walked in from the back of the room, and it was like the second he stepped in there, the whole place just went silent. Like everybody's voice, all the talking that was going on, all just like instantly hushed. And back in those days, he used to walk around and would like actually walk up to every single person and greet you. And I remember like seeing the radiance in his eyes. It was different than anything I've ever experienced. The warmth that came from his eyes, that chuckle, he had that very warm chuckle, and just his ability to greet everybody. So then I remember he went up on stage, and it looked as if like he was on remote control, like nobody was walking him. He had like a very interesting walk. It was like slow, but it felt like, or almost like appeared like there was no central control unit that was walking him. It was like the body was walking itself across the stage.
Yeah.
So
I had the sense once I went up to ask him a question. It was about procrastination, and I don't know. I had the sense that it's almost like he would. You know how Buddha relics have the energy kind of their own energy. It felt like being like that, but different. And also at some point I got the flash that he wasn't really doing anything physically. It was just like somebody was, like a puppet, like somebody was operating him. And but as you're asking a question, you have to focus on the question. You have to snap out of it. It can't just be
yeah,
like. So I kind of just like focused on my interaction with him, and because otherwise, you wouldn't be able to say anything intelligible. So you have to like bring yourself back almost.
yeah, it's pretty intense sitting in the chair across from him, asking him questions, and when you lock eyes with him, it's almost like you like almost go into a state of joy just looking at him. And I know he would say that that's the joy of your own inner self with a capital S that you're experiencing. It's not him. So, but and also the nervousness that people get when you're asking a question in front of hundreds of people, especially at that Long Beach lecture. I remember that one. I think that was titled the Clear Pathway to Enlightenment or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That was a big ballroom with probably 800 people in there.
Yeah. And then he did the Om in that lecture, I think. And yeah, that was quite I think he made a joke that this will like lift the roof off the hotel or something.
Oh yeah, I think I recall that. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I remember, always remember in the audience, there would always be a couple of people that would laugh like hysterically. That would just like really um, get it, and also they would have like a distinctive laugh. So I don't know. There was always this sense of joy I found at the lectures that I haven't found anywhere else, really.
Yeah, I mean that whole time period, back in those days I think it was just so inspirational, and having a teacher to study with and be around, and just the energy was overwhelming in and of itself. And that was like the whole experience. Like when I first moved to Sedona, I had no idea that there was going to be I think there was a group of about maybe 40 or 50 people that were students of him that already lived there. So like when I first moved out there, I started going to doc study groups and of course the miracle study groups. And yeah, life was kind of like, I don't know, in Sedona, there's not a whole lot to do there. It's like hiking, they have good restaurants, but other than that, it was just kind of like a period of like unending spiritual practice, which was pretty cool. It was like every moment of the day you were practicing spiritual concepts or I was watching Dr. Hawkins lectures. If I wasn't at one of his live lectures, or satsangs. It was like every night I would come home from work and put on one of his lectures. So it was just kind of like an unending spiritual practice in those days, which was really quite cool.
So did you move to Sedona at some point?
Yeah, so I moved. Like I said, I moved from Atlanta, Georgia, to California,
Hmm.
and then I was listening to Beyond the Ordinary interviews, and that sort of led to driving out to Sedona. And then I think at some point, I think it was actually after I met Dr. Hawkins, I was listening to this Nightingale Conant program he has called The Highest Level of Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was after I shook his hand that so many of his teachings began to make sense. It was like there was some connection. And I went back to California after meeting him, or I drive out every 2 months to go to these satsangs. And then about November 2006, it was like his own level of consciousness sort of revealed itself to me. And I was like, I remember having like the intention, like if there's somebody on the planet at that level of consciousness, I have to be there. I have to move out there, study with this person, and I'm not going to leave until he leaves the planet. So,
And that's what happened,
yeah.
basically.
So then, yeah, I was looking for like, I remember thinking like, what the hell kind of job am I going to do in Sedona? And I was working at an airport in California, and then I found out Sedona had an airport, and then I was using a lot of the principles of what you hold in mind tends to manifest. So when I came back to California, I found out Sedona has an airport, and I applied for it, and then I just would sit down and visualize myself already working there.
And work.
And then, yeah, and then I ended up going back to Sedona, going up to the airport, submitting an application, my job resume, and then I got a call like 3 weeks later saying, you want to come out and interview? So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll be out next week. So I went out and interviewed the job, and then I got the job, and then it all just worked out pretty much effortlessly. I got the job at the airport, and I moved out to Sedona, and yeah, it was just like almost like destined to happen.
Yeah, I wish I was there at that time, because I remember watching the lecture schedule. I was like, oh man, because they were at the times when I started tracking it in 2006 and 7, there was quite a bit. It wasn't like, it was almost every month, but it wasn't a lecture. It was like satsang lecture, but then as time went on, things would sell out quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was catching on really. So
Yeah, the venue capacity at that Creative Life Center was small, and I think it was selling out so fast. Then they opened this other room next to it called the Satellite Room, and sometimes they'd fill that up, and then eventually they had to move it to Prescott, Arizona, and bigger venues in 2008.
right, I went one time or a couple times. It was in Cottonwood as well.
Oh, Cottonwood, yeah, that's correct.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, which is a small town near Sedona. So when you were in Sedona, did you because obviously it's a small town, so did you when you went about town, did you sometimes see Hawkins just like going shopping or something?
yeah. There was a few experiences I had. Let me think. What was the first one? I think the first time I bumped into him in town was I think my mom and my brother came out to visit me, and I took them to the chapel of the Holy Cross and showed them around that. And then I was living in Cottonwood actually at the time, and then I was like, well, let's head back and we'll stop at Safeway, which is a grocery store in Sedona, and we'll run in and grab some stuff for dinner, and then we'll go back home and chill. And I remember, so we got out of the car, and as soon as the sliding glass doors opened to the grocery store, I heard this voice that just penetrated like all the sound in the room. And it was Dr. Hawkins with one of his friends, and they were checking out at one of the cashiers, and they walked by, and I saw him, and I was like, "Hey, Doc, how's it going?" And he just like looked at me with these eyes. He's like, he had these deep blue eyes, and it was like this blank, bottomless gaze. And he just said hi, and he looked like he was so out of it, like just in this different state. And so I said hi to him. He said hi back, and then like I felt like my entire left brain just like shut down, and I went totally right brain for like 3 hours. Like I couldn't I could couldn't focus on any kind of like form or content. I remember my mom like asking me, "What do you want for dinner?" And I just like couldn't even answer the question. I was like, "Huh? What?" So that was pretty cool. And then one other time I was living in Cottonwood still at the time, and I was driving to the dentist, and I saw him and his friend turning off their road to go into town, and I passed them. I was like, I just happened to notice them. I've like, I don't know, I noticed weird stuff like that. I was like, oh look, Doc had this huge cowboy hat on that was massive, so it was hard to miss.
Right.
Um, I saw them driving into town. I was like, I wonder where they're going. And the thought just kind of crossed my mind. I was like, oh, that's interesting. What if we were going to the same place? I was like, that would be trippy. So then I drive down the road and I go to the dentist, and I see them and they just keep going straight. I'm like, oh, I guess they're going somewhere. Who knows? So I go into the dentist office and I sit down and write my name on the sheet, and then about a minute later they come walking in, and Dr. Hawkins and I had the same time dentist appointment. So he was in the room next to me getting his teeth cleaned, and I was in the room next to him, and I could hear his whole conversation with the dental hygienist ladies. And I just remember him like making them, he was like cracking jokes with them and stuff.
What?
It's
That
pretty,
is crazy.
yeah. Like the
Um,
fact that I had the thought came through the mind, like, what if we were going to the same place? And then I noticed the thought, and then I just like, kind of watched it go by, and then it was like, shit, sure enough, we were going to the same place. Like the coincidence of that was like, I mean, I don't even know. I mean, that was like, how did that align like that? I have no idea.
yeah, there's like 10,000 people or so in Sedona. Yeah, the probabilities for that are really small.
Yeah,
Uh,
it was just one of those things. It was just like, I don't know. I always had like a weird connection with Doc, like just bumping into him at all these places all the time. And then I worked at the airport, and there was a couple times he came through the airport to fly out on a plane to go give a talk out in California. And I would see him at the airport and help him with his bags and help him get on an airplane and stuff.
oh, I
And
didn't know he flew from there. I always assumed it was Phoenix, but I guess it makes sense because it's a smaller trek. You just go to Sedona and
yeah, it's just such a convenient airport to fly out of. And I think most of the time people that wanted him to come speak somewhere, they would charter a plane for him to fly out on. And one time I saw him at the airport, he came through. There was this Learjet on the ramp, and that was my job, was to take care of these private jets. I
mm.
remember this Learjet pulled in, and the pilot got out, and I was like talking to him. I was like, "Oh, so who you picking up today, or who you waiting for?" And he's like, "I don't know, some preacher." And I was like, "Huh, interesting." I had no idea it was going to be Doc. He just said like some preacher. I don't know. I'm picking up some preacher and taking him to California. I'm like, okay, interesting.
Wait, so
Um,
so he was just picking one guy, the Dr. Hunt, and probably his wife as well, right?
yeah, it was his wife and then one of Doc's friends. I think it was the three of them. There might have been one other person, but yeah. So he just said some preacher, and then I'm like, all right, well, I'll keep my eye out for him. And then I was sitting inside the terminal there, and I saw Doc come in, and I was like, oh, damn, I didn't know it was Doc. He's talking about some preacher. So then they knew me at that point. Pretty well. That Doc's wife Susan knew me by name, so because she had seen me a couple times at the airport or asked questions, and so I helped him with his bags, and that was pretty interesting, just bumping into him randomly at the airport.
That's really cool. So you said I remember being there for the lectures, and there was a big community at that point. I remember one time there was this student that was really struggling with something in a group. I don't think you'd mind me sharing this. He was convinced because he shared it in front of the whole group. He was convinced that he was the only doc student that was below 200. So he talked to Doc about it. He got, I don't know, by some coincidence, he got to talk to him, and I don't know, he just wept, but Doc was talking with a friend, and his friend was perplexed, and Doc just said it makes him happy, so that his
I
friend would understand. Like
think
stories like that. It's just like the I think people don't understand how ordinary he was, in a sense. Like, he was okay. His job in New York and stuff like that was like, he was the director of a big clinic in Long Island. But as far as him as a person, he was I would imagine he was just I think you have a lot more to actually should let you speak about that. Like, because there's Doc, like people assume that Doc was always like he was at the lecture, and I understand that's not always the case, right?
yeah, I mean, he was always very animated at a lecture. It was like kind of like the best way I could describe it is, I think he used to say that like when it was time to teach, you know, it's like the Purusha, the self of the capital S within would like sort of light up and start animating itself and speaking and teaching whatever it was that it felt that it needed to teach. And then like when a lecture was over, it was like he would go into a different state and back to like this ultra present, um, this ultra present awareness. And he was just like a very, you know, very ordinary human being. You know, he could blend into a crowd, you know, no problem. You know, you could never pick Dr. Hawkins from a crowd because he was, although his voice was very interesting and his eyes were very interesting, but he always dressed very ordinary outside of a lecture and always had this sense of humor. You know, I remember a few times going to the local church that he attended. He used to go to this Episcopal church there in Sedona, and we got to, you know, every now and then he'd come to the church and we get to take communion with him. And, you know, he'd crack jokes like the church band would be playing and he'd like lean over to somebody and be like, man, they could really use a bassist. And just like, you know, funny stuff that would just totally catch you off guard. I remember one time somebody was kneeling down next to him at the rail to get communion, and they put the wafer in his hand and he was just like, thanks. So he didn't have like this, you know, this outwardly holier than thou or pious attitude. You know, his
Yeah,
posture was very subjective, I'm sure. You know, he would never you know, do things that would you know, make you seem that he was like a spiritual teacher. Like you wouldn't see him walking around like with his, you know, his hands clasped like this necessarily outside of a lecture or doing anything that was, you know, unusual.
yeah. I think there's stuff in the Bible about like praying so that other people see that you pray, or stuff like that. Seems like a bit of a promotion, kind of self-indulgence, almost like oh, look at me, I'm so holy and all that. And he seemed to with his humor, he seemed to like showcase that this is like, I remember one during the lecture, he once was making a joke of this magazine that was had women that would like, the wind is blowing and the woman is like, sitting in a yoga pose, and he was making it like, he was explaining that it's glamorization of spirituality, basically.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. I got to witness that firsthand one time because he did this lecture that I don't know if anybody really knew about it, but it was at the Hilton in Sedona, and it was this big New Age um, 3-day event, and there was all these weird colored lights all over the stage and sparkly drapes, and you know, all these New Age speakers were talking. There was like even belly dancers, I think, on the stage.
Oh my gosh.
And I remember we went. The only way you could go to this is if you volunteered for this event. And that was the only way you could see him speak. And so I
Really?
remember like belly dancers came out, and he actually like stood up and picked up his chair and spun it around and made his back face the stage. It was like he was making some sort of kind of an outwardly statement about that. Who knows what it was, but it was obvious that he was you know, kind of blocking himself from that energy. So that was kind of interesting.
Who was blocking? Wait, Doc was there.
Yeah, Doc's the one that like he took his chair because he was facing the stage, and then he moved his chair and then turned his back towards the stage, like he was somehow like, you know,
Wow.
blocking his energy from this energy that of these speakers on stage, which was kind of fascinating.
But why was Doc there? Was it there some kind of
Uh, he was giving a talk. He was one of the speakers there. So yeah, he got up and he
oh,
had like I think he had like an hour to speak. So then he got up and spoke, and it was he gave a whole spiel on the map of consciousness and spiritual practice and flipping over the beetle and how that kind of stuff is an act of love. And I remember he got like a standing ovation when he was done, because he just stood out from all the different speakers there. He had a very genuine traditional kind of form of spirituality. Doc talked a lot about the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and Jesus's teachings and Ramana Maharshi or Nisargadatta Maharaj and that kind of stuff. So, which a lot of people on that new age spirituality have never heard of those kinds of people.
right. All right. A lot of people that go into Doc, they encounter this, and they try to calibrate themselves, calibrate a lot of things. I feel like this is one of the like people get into Doc, and some of them like just totally discard it, and they're like, no, the calibrations are off, or they're like, you can't really tell what's true or not with a muscle test. But what was your experience with seeing Doc calibrate and then uh, other Doc students?
Well, I would say, I'm not really sure how many people actually follow the proper guidelines for muscle testing. That's why I only really trust myself. And even Buddha said, put no head above your own. I trust the consciousness calibrations that Dr. Hawkins himself put out, and then I just kind of do it myself. But there's a lot of proper guidelines that I'm not really sure people follow. And I think it really takes quite a bit of spiritual practice within yourself to get to a place where you could remain objective in your results. So,
Yeah,
you truly have to be scientific about it and truly not have any invested interest in outcomes. So, I think about the confusion that students get into nowadays with it. And sometimes I get frustrated. I'm like, why did Dr. Hawkins even teach it if it's going to lead to such confusion with people? But then, I'm sure that he must have saw something about it that was, obviously he was probably aware of that fact. But the fact is, that we could test the truth of anything using a simple muscle test. That's so profound in and of itself. There's so much you could find out about anything in this universe with this simple technique. And a lot of people kind of poo-poo Dr. Hawkins for, they focus a lot on the numbers of consciousness calibrations or the map of consciousness, but they don't really focus on like the crux of his teaching, which was to transcend the identification with the ego mind and realize the self with a capital S. If you really look at his body of work as a whole, you know it's I think it's uninteresting to a lot of people. A lot of people, there's probably very few people that are truly interested in transcending the ego, uh, the identification with the ego, because it pretty much threatens everything. You're talking about letting go of identifying with thoughts, with the body, your story, um, all the positionalities that you have about everything from, veganism to politics to, whatever it may be.
those are big ones. And I think politics is another one where I've heard some stories. When he was lecturing, there was an event in Phoenix called Celebrate Your Life, and it was I think a 2 or 3 day event. I'm not sure. And but it was a different kind of crowd than because a lot of the people didn't know Dr. Hawkins there apparently. And this is just speaking from what I've heard from people that were there. And I heard a story that a lady was with an internal battle with herself because he was in one of the talks, he was talking a lot about calibrations, and he mentioned people like Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly, and some of these people, and he calibrated them pretty high. I mean, 300 something it was, and some of them had. This lady actually stepped out, and then well, she came back, but that's one example. I think some people probably totally dismiss it, and I think it's unfortunate that because of they might read Power versus Force and love it, and then by the time they get to Truth versus Falsehood, which is the big one for political calibrations, they might yeah. So but do you think it was done like obviously there's value in it, like I myself get tremendous value in it. What do you think was, I don't know, what do you think of it, the Truth versus Falsehood, and what was your reaction when you first read it?
Well, I never really had any cherished positionalities when I got into Dr. Hawkins and Nisargadatta Maharaj. I was just completely starving for the absolute truth, whatever that was. Because I always had questions going through my mind, like, what's the purpose of life? We're all just kind of walking around waiting for the body to die. So what can we do on this planet, in the meantime, to make it meaningful or of value? So my interest was always in, realizing whatever that supreme reality was that Krishna speaks of, or, Dr. Hawkins spoke of, or Nisargadatta spoke of. So I never really had any cherished positionalities when I came into Dr. Hawkins' work. And, I think a lot of people, like nowadays, we see all these new students coming into his work, and most of them read Power versus Force, and then they read Letting Go. But I think very few students are actually reading Eye of the I, or I. For whatever reason, I've seen like a gap of like 10 years go by from the time somebody picks up Power versus Force to finding Eye of the I, or I reality and subjectivity. It's almost like some aspect of oneself just isn't ready for that. And Doc even has a caveat in the beginning of those books that says, if to the traditional religionist or spiritual person, this information could be upsetting. So, he puts those caveats in the beginning of his books. But for me, when I look at all of Dr. Hawkins as a whole, I started having all kinds of weird experiences when I, moved to Sedona. I played a lot with the whole idea of letting go conceptual thought and watching his lectures around the clock. And, I got just subjective confirmation over and over and over again that the truth and the reality of that which he was saying was indeed the truth. Having 2 encounters with angels that I can't describe. And then also something that's, I don't really like to mention too much, but having sort of psychic attacks at night. So I could, something was obviously, threatened by that, which, the energy of what I was exposing myself to. So there was just all these objective confirmations of the truth and the reality of that which he was.
So what do you think? I think Doc spoke about the attacks, that the basically the lower astral sees you as a threat. So they see that you're making progress and they attack you. Did you ever ask Doc personally about the attacks?
I don't think I asked him personally. I'm trying to think. No, but I remember having an attack the night before a lecture, and there was a whole group of us that were having the same experience, and one of the people in the local group emailed him and asked him about it, and he basically said, take it as a compliment, because they wouldn't be coming after you unless you were making significant progress. So that was interesting. And when you're spending all of your time exposing yourself to non-duality, whether it's Dr. Hawkins' teachings calibrating in the 800s and 900s, you're sitting around reading the Upanishads all day long. You're practicing the Zen teachings of Huang Po. This stuff comes at you after a while. And I think it's frightening when it first happens, but like I said, hearing from the teacher himself to take it as a compliment. And then he said, refute it, because the self with the capital S is immune, and only the ego, self with a small s, is subject to attack.
So like refute it in the name of Jesus.
Yeah, like in the cases that it happened to me, the way it was refuted was it would happen in a hypnagogic state right before falling asleep. It's like you're going to bed at night, and there's a state in between the waking state and the dream state, and it's like a hypnagogic state, and it would happen in that small little window. And every time it happened, there was like an automatic energy field within myself that would just start repeating Gloria in Excelsis Deo, and that seemed to really piss them off. That was one of the interesting experiences that happened to me. Was this attack came on one night. I think I was playing with the Zen teaching of Huang Po, letting go conceptual thought. And I think for about 4 hours before bed, I didn't allow a single thought to arise within my consciousness. And that really seemed to piss some kind of energy off. And then that attack happened, and that prayer started up in my mind, Gloria in Excelsis Deo, Gloria in Excelsis Deo. And you actually literally hear snarling sounds, like you actually literally get your ass kicked. It's weird.
So it's kind of like the Padre Pio movie where he's got attacked, but you don't see it. Do you see a thing, or do you feel it like in your spirit, or what is it like?
Yeah, you feel it. It's audible, and you feel it. It's like you can feel all these hands, invisible hands all over you, and they're literally beating the shit out of you. And
oh my gosh.
So this prayer started up, and then my mind, it was like some aspect of yourself says this prayer, and then all of a sudden that stopped, and then I heard this, what sounded like 100 angels singing Gloria in Excelsis Deo. It was like an angelic choir started up, and that's really what stopped it from happening further. And then I woke up, like you sit up in bed, you realize without a doubt in your mind exactly what just happened. So there was that kind of stuff. That's sort of the confirmation that, this kind of stuff is the real deal,
Oh yeah, for sure it was. I think nowadays students, since Doc has passed away, the students aren't privy to his lectures and him being there, because I feel like the community that was there was so strong. Especially you'd go into Sedona, and there was like I remember one time we went to this Thai place that was like the favorite Thai place of Dr. Hawkins. They even got like a discount because the owner was like, I guess was fond of Hawkins. Must have like because I think some people can, even though you say he was ordinary, I think some people in a high enough state, they could intuit, they could probably pick out that Dr. Hawkins is not just a regular person, but is really a mystic.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you ever experience somebody that did not know Hawkins at all, but then kind of would be like, whoa, he must have had that happen in his life. But maybe we just don't know, right?
Well, I had some interesting, like when he came to the airport a couple times, and my boss, I had had conversations with my boss that that I had a spiritual teacher in town that I studied with, and when my boss saw him, I was like, yeah, that was the guy that I go to lectures, I go to his lectures, and nobody could ever say anything bad about him. Everybody was a skeptic, I'm sure, but my boss took one look at him and he was like, that guy looks exactly like the Wizard of Oz. And I was just like, oh my God, like how true is that? I mean, that was his contextualization,
And
then
that's
this
all
other,
he said.
that was all he said. He didn't say anything negative. He just said that guy looked exactly like the Wizard of Oz. And then this other lady met him, and she kind of knew of him, but has no idea about what his teachings were. And I said, yeah, that was Dr. Hawkins. And she goes, you know what he reminds me of? And I was like, what's that? She's like, the absent-minded professor. And like, again, like it was just so funny, like the comments that would randomly, spontaneously come out of people's mouths about him.
Yeah, I remember one time we went to it was a lecture, Frank Gray's lecture, and she was talking about, because I think her education is mystics and theology and stuff like that. She was talking about mystics, and But at the end of the lecture, we played a video that I think it was one of the last, like it was like a 10 or 15-minute video of Dr. Hawkins and Susan, and there was like pictures of his home and all that. I think it was called "Love is the Infinite Law of the Universe" or something.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this guy was kind of I think he lived in Sedona. He was an older gentleman, but he never went to a lecture, and but he somehow found his way to the Frank Grace lecture. Anyway, he was kind of not he was neutral about Hawkins. He just didn't know. But then we watched the video of, that video, the love video, and after it, he almost was crying, and he was like, "Wow, I can see why you guys, why this person has lifted Sedona, and why so many people come to see him." I was like, "Wow, just from that video, it was just amazing."
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I'm not sure if I met anybody, but it was just one of those things, like you had to be, it was either, your destiny or it wasn't, So I used to talk a lot about Doc. Nowadays, I don't really talk about it too much unless somebody asks me, then I'll talk about it. But if somebody doesn't ask me, I usually don't bother really mentioning much of it, just because I know that was my path, So I don't proselytize any of his teachings anymore.
Yeah, it almost seems like they have to be kind of attracted to it, like because sometimes I'd give books away, even letting go, but I think most of the time people don't read it, or don't apply it, or don't get the significance of it. It is what it is. It can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people too, I think one of the big confusions that arises on the spiritual path, especially if one is like seriously interested in enlightenment, but because because the ego identifies with the person, with the small self, with
Hmm.
a, self with a small s, just because we think we're a person, we automatically project that onto the teacher and say, well, he's also a person. Why did Dr. Hawkins say this? Why did Dr. Hawkins do that? And, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions, or one of the biggest obstacles on the way to enlightenment, is thinking that there's a separate individual personal self called Dr. Hawkins. And until that illusion dissolves, that there's a duality between the teacher and the student, the reality of the self is going to remain obscure to most people. So I
Hmm.
think that's a huge point, that we're so convinced that, because we see ourselves as personal, we project that onto the teacher and think that that's a personal self also, instead of realizing it's the infinite field of consciousness giving a lecture to itself.
Yeah.
Just like, there's the notion that there's two separate people talking right now, but it's really just consciousness having a conversation with itself. So I think that's, you know, part of the practice to get into that place, that Dr. Hawkins spoke of so much.
I once because you said, like you mentioned a few times now, that once you get into that space of right brain, like really high space, it's hard to function. And I remember one time, in France it takes 2 years to become a Catholic, right? And I knew this French guy. He was probably the best Catholic that I've seen. But he wasn't Catholic yet because he was going through the process. And he told me that he had a spiritual experience, and he was a lawyer, you see, and he said for about a period of 2 or 3 months, he said, I was useless. I tried to do some work, but I wrote a little bit at work, but my brain was just useless to me. I
Oh my
just thought it's
gosh.
so funny, but it's I think it's the adjustment, the Holy Spirit, or the Kundalini adjustment of the brain. It takes a while. So did you ever have a period where, for a longer period of time, you were kind of the logical left brain was hardly functioning?
Not for a long period of time, but there was just episodes. I
Yeah.
remember one specifically. I went to this kind of a Christmas gathering with all these Dr. Hawkins students, and we're all sitting in this room together. And it was somebody's bright idea to start reading the Upanishads in front of everybody. And I was sitting there in this chair, and in those days, I was using the surrender technique quite a bit, which is, consists of letting go of wanting to change anything, letting go of wanting to control anything or resist anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting there in the room while these people were passing around the Upanishads, reading verses from it. And all of a sudden I went into this state where I couldn't stop laughing. And the laughter got so intense, I had to physically remove myself from the room. And it was noticeable. Like, everybody kind of stopped reading and they started looking at me and they're like, "Is everything okay?" I'm like, I'll be okay. And I couldn't stop laughing. And I went outside. I had to remove myself from the room because it was so intense. I couldn't distinguish between myself and everything in the room. It was like, if you asked me what I was in that moment, I would say no thingness. There wasn't anything in particular that I could point at and say that was me. It was like instantly I became everything in the room. And the joy of that, I couldn't stop laughing. So I went outside, and this house that we were at was out in the middle of the desert. And I went outside to remove myself because I couldn't stop laughing. And as soon as I get outside, I look up at the sky, and there was like, you could see like tens of thousands of stars. And I kept on laughing because I couldn't distinguish between myself and the universe. And, this lasted for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. But, it's things like that are, again, they're confirmations of the path, subjective experiences that you can't really describe. And, I think even to this day, if you're a serious spiritual student, I think you could, at least where I'm at right now, like, I'm pretty functionable, but I'm not like in any incredible state or anything like that. But I think you still, like, when you're focused on spiritual practice, consistently, you tend to miss a lot of details. So I still, like, today, probably the most troublesome thing I deal with is just, struggling with details of things.
Yeah, I kind of at work, a few months ago, I was kept forgetting what I did yesterday, like, and that's not helpful when when they rely on you, and you're working in a restaurant, and yeah, things like that.
It
So
takes a lot of extra focus, I think, to, kind of focus in on details, because the world gets so caught up with the details of every little tiny thing. And Dr. Hawkins used to joke about that a lot. Like, he's like, they want to know the detail of every little thing. Did your lunch cost $1.35 or was it $1.36? He's like, I don't know. I tell the IRS it was $2. Save them all that hassle, The world's obsessed with the details. And I think when you get, when you focus on spirituality and letting go of identifying with the ego mind and identifying with context instead of content, it's just that, you just lose that interest in every single little detail,
I'm talking about details. I think this is kind of important detail, because a lot of people in spiritual circles, they're very anti any kind of drugs and all that. And we all know that Doc was a psychiatrist and all that. And so I think that's another thing, because people always have positionalities. So they have veganism and all that, and then they're anti-psychiatric drugs because they're like, well, I'm not gonna take anything because drugs are, the pharmaceutical companies and all that stuff. So being a doc student for a while now, what is your position? I guess your position on, or how would you describe doc position on, like, things like veganism and like psychiatric drugs?
Well, I mean, I went through an episode when I was in Sedona where I experienced some severe depression, and luckily I was volunteering at Dr. Hawkins' ranch at the time, and one of the people down there that volunteered with me was a state psychologist, and she noticed that I was depressed. She said, "Josh, you look really depressed." And I was struggling with, I'd lost 3 really close people in my life all at the same time. So I was struggling with suppressed grief. I had a friend of mine commit suicide, and then another best friend died in a car accident. So I had all this grief that was piling up, and I suppressed it. So that led to depression. So she noticed that I was depressed, and she said, let's go inside and talk to Dr. Hawkins for a minute. So I went, and she brought me inside, and he was sitting there in his chair, and told him he wasn't interested in the story at all. He didn't didn't care about the story. He didn't want to hear the story. He just said, your brain chemistry is a little off, and just take an antidepressant for a little bit. It'll correct itself and you'll be right back to normal in no time. So I did his advice. I did everything physically, mentally, and spiritually that I could. I went to a nurse practitioner and took his advice. I got on an antidepressant. And then I was also using the letting go technique, allowing the grief to come up, allowing myself to cry. So I was using the surrender technique constantly. And then I've always had a passion for the gym. So I've, always believed in going to the gym and exercising and working out. So I did all those three things. And one afternoon, I remember I had this severe attachment come up, and it was a 10-hour workday. And this attachment came up in my solar plexus in my stomach. And I used the surrender technique on it. And by the end of the shift, the severe attachment disappeared, and I went into the state of like verging on, it was like high joy, almost ecstasy. And that state lasted for like 3 days. And after that happened, I dropped the antidepressants and never had to get back on them again. So that was pretty cool. It was just sort of a, so now when I, if I have any kind of like states like that come up, like I know how to handle them now. It's not as scary as it was once before.
Yeah, and people don't realize how practical letting go is. Like, obviously, you needed antidepressant for a while, but once you get rid of the underlying cause, you might call it the suppressed emotions, then you're good.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, even to this day, I'm truly convinced that like the fastest way to a state of happiness is to constantly look for the underlying emotion that we're suppressing, and use the surrender or letting go technique on those emotions, because every spiritual experience I've had in my life has almost been directly a consequence of using the letting go technique that he talks about in his letting go book.
So the way you use letting go is you go into the negative emotions, or do you also use the flip side, which is stop resisting the positive?
Both, I would say, for sure. So yeah, there's I dived into the Sedona method quite a bit. So the Sedona method talks about, that underneath all feelings, there's, kind of 3 or 4 basic underlying programs that are the root of all feelings, which is wanting to control, wanting approval, wanting security, or wanting to be separate. So I use those 4 things a lot, along with letting go of resisting whatever I was experiencing, and then also like diving into the core of whatever I was feeling. So like depression, for an example, like when I was depressed, that was suppressed grief. So in those days, I just kind of prayed for it to come up, and then I just allowed myself to cry. I noticed I was never allowing myself to just cry up a river. And the more I'd cry, the more you let go of that grief. So it's like each emotion has its own like workable technique on how you apply it, but it's a letting go of resisting the grief. Allow yourself to cry. There's nothing wrong with crying. Anger, you're not angry enough.
Yeah.
Get more angry. And you start looking at all those little areas of life that you're wanting to change or control, constantly. It's like we constantly want to change everything, constantly want to control everything. So-and-so in the White House is not okay with me. This can't be, all those little things, from wanting to change the traffic lights on the freeway or change the traffic, or, you just see how much the ego and its willfulness is really involved in it, everything.
Yeah, people don't realize that. I think Doc has alluded to this a lot, that the negative karmic experiences are actually an opportunity for you to let go. It's like a gift, but we don't see it as a gift. I myself had, after I saw that lecture in 2008, I had some stuff happen in personal life that really brought me like the lowest I've been. I think I firmly believe that it was kind of causal, like because I've been to the lecture and all that, the new program went in. I was like, okay, you're ready for this. Here we go. And put me on a roller coaster, and it was not fun, but I think I did learn a lot from it, and I'm still learning from it, because it was such a such a deep thing that happened to me. Like for other people, it might seem not a big deal, but it depends on, yeah, it depends on personally how you take it. Like if you really connected to a person and that person dies, like in your experience, 3 people die in a row, boom, that's gonna be a big experience.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, death is always it's a in his book called Healing and Recovery. It's what does he call it? A major life crisis.
Yeah.
So
What would
yeah.
be,
What's that?
sorry, go ahead.
Well, going back to like the Doc's position on Doc really never took a position on much of anything. He kind of always went with what it calibrated. Um, you know, he wasn't a vegan. He definitely believed in eating meat. He would say something like, if you believe in death, then yeah, I suggest not eating meat. But until you see death as an illusion, once you realize death is an illusion, then you realize that, and everything serves each other. He talks about the Rig Veda and how all life serves each other. And Doc was, with the antidepressants, Doc was a firm believer that antidepressants came about as a consequence of the evolution of mankind, so there's nothing negative about it. I think where you get yourself into trouble is if you're not doing everything you can spiritually, mentally, and physically to overcome some sort of illness or whatever it may be.
Yeah, he was very pragmatic, and that's what I
Yeah.
really loved about it. And that's how I try to take that attitude in all areas of life. Not that I'm succeeding totally, but like I really love that attitude. Kind of,
Yeah, keep it simple too, keep it very simple. You don't have to complicate spirituality. You don't have to complicate anything. And then there's people, I know people in my life that resist at all costs taking antidepressants. I've seen people in my life that are depressed and they refuse to take antidepressants out of some positionality that they're holding. And what they're really resisting is happiness. What you're really resisting when you say, no, I'm not going to take antidepressants, is you're really saying that um, I don't accept the grace of God. If you really wanted to get better, you wouldn't be resisting getting better.
yeah, they want to get to the destination the hard way. They're like, no, no, I'm not gonna cheat. I'm not gonna cheat by
Yeah.
taking the antidepressant. I'm gonna slug it out. I'm gonna, you
Yeah,
know.
it's like getting your foot cut off and saying, "No, I'm not going to go to a doctor to get it sewed back on. I'm just going to let myself bleed out."
Yeah, I'm gonna just imagine the leg, the foot just growing back naturally.
Yeah. Well, and two, like also, if you're familiar with A Course in Miracles, Doc talked very heavily about lesson number 76, which states that I am under no laws but God's. So if you truly think that various substances out in the world, whether it's antidepressants or eating meat or all these various things have an effect on you, they will. A lot of people used to get upset at the fact that Doc drank Diet Pepsi. They're like, that stuff kills you, right? And
Yeah,
you
sugar in
know,
it, sugar, sugar, sugar.
yeah. So I mean, it's your mindset. That what you hold in mind is what's giving it the power. If you truly think that all these things are going to kill you, then guess
They
what? They
will.
will. But if you do the Course in Miracles and realize that you're under no laws but God's, um, you stop taking a position about all these things and live with that freedom.
I remember when I first started Course in Miracles, I was the kind of new doc student, and I remember I came to lesson 7 or 10, and just like it was beyond me. I was like, wow, and I should have stuck to that, but I didn't, and it took me another, I think, a year almost to restart it again and actually like try to do it properly. But did you talk about your experience with the workbook?
I've done the workbook several times. Sometimes I start it up for a while, then I have to take a break from it. Then I usually pick up like where I've left off, because if you read like the introduction, it's really not so much. I don't think it's so important like doing it necessarily. Um, day 1 through 365. It's kind of the emphasis is on just getting it done at some point in your lifetime. And I had some interesting experiences doing it, mostly like experiences of like knowingness, like kind of psychic phenomena, what Doc called the Siddhis. knowing things before they happened, um, going into some states of high joy doing some of the lessons, but it was mostly like getting, these messages in my mind, like when somebody needed help. I remember one time I was at the gym and I was doing the Course in Miracle workbook, and I saw this guy lifting this heavy weight, and this voice came into my mind and just said, you need to go stand over by him because he's about to drop that on himself. So it was like a lot of weird, like psychic phenomena like that. Like, it was almost like the workbook like puts you in places for other people, not so much for yourself, but it's like it kind of sets you up to be a servant to others, So
Yeah,
that
like
was,
the Saint Francis of Assisi prayer, to be an instrument of God's will. Oh, I don't really know the prayer actually. I should know the prayer.
yeah. Well, I mean, basically being a servant, and so yeah, it was kind of interesting with the Course in Miracles. Not everything that we do spiritually is just for our benefit. It's a lot of times it could be for somebody else. So it was
Yeah.
interesting, and you could tell the difference between your own thought versus when like the Holy Spirit, you could say, is talking to you.
Oh,
There's a distinct knowingness, and it's hard to describe because I wish I could describe it better, but it's almost like it comes out of the blue, like a lot, like, although I noticed this guy lifting this heavy weight, the knowingness that came to me to go stand by him, came from something outside of myself, which is kind of hard to describe. But it was like, you need to, the message I got was like, you need to go stand by this guy because he's about to drop this on his throat.
and sure enough, he did.
And sure enough, yeah, like 5 seconds later, he dropped it. Nobody was around to see him. I was the only person there, and I noticed it, and I ran over there and helped him lift this weight off himself.
He could have
So,
died.
I mean, I don't know. He probably could have tilted the weights off of it, but still, he was struggling and he was worried, and I could see that he was in distress. So that was
Wow.
interesting. And then, just knowing people's names before before you meet them, various things like that started happening doing the Course in Miracles workbook.
Yeah, I
So
need to go back to that. Actually, my first question to Doc was because I had only did 150 lessons and then I stopped. And then I procrastinated when I'll start doing it again. See, I should have been like, I'm just going to resume rather than, I failed. I need to restart it again. And that was my thinking.
yeah, I think that's one of the things that I used to think that way too. I remember, beating myself up for it and stuff like that. And I think eventually you just kind of, it just doesn't even matter. Just, start up wherever you left off and just keep going, because every lesson is so powerful in that thing.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So, any advice for people that are just getting into Hawkins and, obviously not, I think most people nowadays probably start with letting go. I think that's probably or power versus force.
yeah, I mean, I usually recommend reading Eye of the Eye first because I think it really like lays the context of where Doc's speaking from. A lot of people that read Power versus Force first, they're like, oh, this is some scientist, writing this book, blah, blah, blah. But when you read Eye of the Eye first, you kind of realize, he talks about the very first chapter, he talks about his own spiritual enlightenment and what happened. And it sort of sets the framework for the rest of the books, I think. So, I mean, I always recommend, whoever's going to be attracted to him is going to be attracted to him. But I think just keep exposing yourself to the books, to the lectures, to the satsangs. And, it's really the best thing you could do, that entrainment, that concept of entrainment by just exposing yourself constantly to those higher energies, whether it's Dr. Hawkins or the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita, and read the list of spiritual teachers that he lists in the back of his book, the 100 spiritual teachers.
And also avoiding what is calibrated below 200, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think that's something I think that probably doesn't dawn on most students until a little bit later. But yeah, I think the later you get into spirituality, the more if you're seriously interested in enlightenment and spirituality, to avoid that which calibrates below 200. And then
And
you start to like, I think it's kind of staggering sometimes the amount of stuff in this world that calibrates below 200. I mean, the movies that we watch, the TV shows that everybody's hooked on, a lot of forms of music. There's just so much stuff in this world that you realize is, you know, in Dr. Hawkins' terminology, would make your body go weak like 13 times a minute just by exposing yourself to this stuff.
For those of you who don't know, 200 is on the map of consciousness is the dividing line, and below it is basically non-integrity, what makes the body go weak when you muscle test, and above it is what makes the body go strong and is supportive of life, and below it is destructive of life. Um, anyway, I think this would be a good place to end this talk. Thank you very much for being on the show. I really enjoyed it. I think more people need to know about Hawkins. That's why I kind of hope that in some small way, even if one person like picks up a doc book based on this particular interview, then I'm happy.
Yeah, for sure. No, it was good, great talking to you, Matt, and hopefully we could do this again sometime. We could kind of delve into some other topics, probably deeper too.
All right. All right. Well, if you're watching, thank you for watching, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.